I am Kyle Paul. Previously, I ran a GDG chapter, a Google Developer Group chapter, similar to what's putting on this event here. So I hosted DevFest and stuff like that. I was a Google Developer Expert. Who's here heard of the Google Developer Expert program? Couple? All right. Couple hands for Google Developer Experts. So these are experts that Google has recognized in Google's technologies. And then we also have a Women Tech Makers program. And so I was involved in the Women Tech Makers program. But now I am at Google. So I can't be a part of those programs because now I look after those programs across North America. And so I'm here representing our developer ecosystem team, which reaches out to the communities around these various developer technologies. And also, no presentation is good without cats. So you have to have cats. These are my two little kitties, Penny and Jules. They're adorable, and one of the very few photos where they're not trying to attack each other and be playing and stuff like that. They're very calm. So very adorable, I love them. And then that is my Twitter handle down there at the bottom for the Twitterverse. Maybe. Oh. Right. I don't know where it's going, but cool. All right, quick show of hands. Who's heard of PWAs? Cool. Who's used a PWA?
Used one?
Used a PWA, yes. Cool. Do I have any native mobile developers in here? Android, iOS, native mobile developers? All right, got a handful of you. And then, so I assume the rest of you are identify as web developers, yes? Web developers? All right, cool. So how many of you have visited the DevFest website for Florida? Should be everybody's hand, all right? So those of you who didn't raise your hand when you used a PWA, that is a PWA. So today we'll be covering, why are there PWAs? How did we get here? We'll also be talking about what are PWAs. So understanding the fundamentals of PWAs, how to build PWAs. So the architecture, things like that. And then I'm going to dive into some examples, resources, and tools that you can utilize to build your PWAs. This talk is not going to be focused on building PWAs with a particular framework. So the tools and stuff that I'm presenting today, you will be able to bring to vanilla JavaScript, Angular, React, Vue, whatever, Ionic, whatever framework that you're using and whatever your project is using, whatever your company is using, you'll be able to utilize the tools that I'm going to give you today across any of these frameworks. So we're going to look at how did we get here. So as we all learned in grade school, we have to understand the history before we can move forward, right? So we're going to do a short history lesson about how the web has changed in order to get us to where PWAs are today. One thing that we learned is software distribution is really, really hard. It's very difficult. Remember this building? There's not many of them left, if any. But back in that time, we used to drive to this local computer store to buy the latest software on disks. And then we would have to come home, install it, and this included anytime we needed to get an update for that software we needed. It usually looked like this. So a pile of disks. This is before CD-ROM and DVDs. So for the young people in the crowd. And so we used to have to install these, and you have to install them sequentially. And if you get the order mixed up, you have to start the process all over again sometimes, or it just errors at you and errors at you until you figure out what you did wrong.
That's not fair to let me walk in and see that screen.
So I actually have this set. So this is Office 95. But you had to do all of this in order to get your software out there in the hands of your consumers. It was very difficult. First, you had to get them to buy it from a physical brick and mortar store. Then you had to teach them how to install your software. And then connectivity speeds started to improve, where they didn't have to always drive to the store. They could just go to the website and go to your company's website, buy it, and it would be shipped to them. So they still had to do the manual process of taking this physical media and installing it on their devices. So it was very cumbersome to your users to get software into the hands of your users. But now we started to see applications come out that allowed us to receive these updates over the internet and be able to install and have access to the software right away without having to manually install using physical media. We were able to just download files from the internet, install them. So it made it much easier to get our software into the hands of our users. And then software came along like Gmail, where it's live on the web. We didn't have to install anything. It just works. And many of you don't think about this, but do you realize you have a brand new version of Gmail every single day? It's evergreen. You don't have to do anything with updates. You don't have to, yes, okay, agree to install, and go through all that headache. So Gmail users just actively use the freshest version all the time. It's great. It just works. Similar to things like this. I don't have a massive encyclopedia set. I'm now using Encarta. I don't use Encarta either, because that was something I had to physically install and then get updates all the time. I use services like Wikipedia and IMDb to find the latest and greatest resources, because it's not stagnant. I'm able to consume this right away, find what I need, and it just works. I don't have to install, buy, and use all of this stuff. And so as XKCD points out, the easiest, most friction-free platform is the web. Everybody has it on all their mobile devices, their tablets, their laptops. A lot of TVs are coming with it now. So you have this platform that's available to all of your users. They already have it, and you have a distribution model that can easily get to them using the internet. And how you can get them access to your application is through a URL. So you don't have to have them install everything all the time. It just works through the URL. But what was missing from the web? So you didn't have things like home screen access. So whenever you added a website or whatever, they would have to save it as a bookmark if they wanted to keep it later on their mobile devices, things like that. You didn't have push notifications to alert and re-engage your users. You didn't have offline reliability, where if they're on an airplane or they're on a train going through the tunnel, there was these access and connectivity issues. Then you have certain device APIs, like access to the Bluetooth, camera, the connectivity state even. Like you didn't know if when you're browsing around on a website and then all of a sudden you lose connectivity, the website didn't know that it lost connectivity. It just would try and load something. The browser didn't even know about this. So these are things that are coming out. And this is why, these were things that were problems. And so this is why app stores came to be. So you have the iOS App Store and the Android Play Store. You have these new tools where we're distributing apps, and our companies and our games that we're creating, we're putting these out in the hands of our users. But again, in a sense, we took a step backwards on how we're distributing our software to our users. No offense to the native developers in the room. We just took a step backwards because the web wasn't ready yet on how we got our content to be able to be consumed by our users. So with native apps, the struggles with this, so for those of you that aren't native app developers, it's a pay-to-play kind of thing. You have to pay to put your app in the store. You have to register to be a developer. You have to pay for that service. And you have to write an app in native code. Then you have to compile it to a binary. Then you have to sign and package it. Then you have to submit it to one of those two stores. And then you have to wait between 30 minutes to a week or maybe even a month before it even appears in that store. And then you have to wait, fingers crossed, hopefully somebody downloads your app and starts to use it. So there's a lot of these you're reinstating a lot of these friction points that we removed when everybody was moving to the web. We added these back in. The average cost for getting an app in the hands of a user is $1.50 to get somebody to install your app if you're advertising it out there. $1.50 per user. To get that same user to come back and use it over the course of 3 months is an additional $2.50 in advertising dollars, just to get them to keep re-engaging with your mobile app. So there's an extra cost involved in making sure your app grows and scales. And then there's these other parts. Not everybody has the latest and greatest maximum smartphone out there. So not everybody has 64 gigs available on their devices. So you're installing certain apps that just get huge amounts of storage space on your device. You have data plans. Not everybody can download a massive app, and so that's where there's certain options in the Play Store and the App Store where like, hey, you should download this app over Wi-Fi because it's huge. And so you have these extra barriers of friction. And then you have processing speeds of certain devices. Not every device has the latest CPU in it or GPU. You have these kind of barriers across these devices. And then you run into certain cases with OS updates. For the native developers, do you remember when Apple changed to the 64-bit and you had to recompile and resubmit all of your binaries? So that was due to the iOS update, which forced all app developers that had an app going to the Apple App Store. You had to resubmit any app or it was going to be removed from the App Store. So you have these extra barriers that sometimes come with the OS. Android is guilty of this as well, so it's not just an Apple thing. So that's kind of what happened and why we went to native apps. That's why native apps kind of exist. So what is a progressive web app? Right? So does anybody about 10 plus years ago remember Google Gears? Any web developers remember? I got some head nods, a couple hands went up. So how about application cache or app cache? Any more hands, heads? Oh, interesting. So nodded at Google Gears, but application cache was even newer than Google Gears. So that's interesting. I haven't had that flip yet. Cool. So, but these were web technologies that came up to try and solve this kind of issue of how to make an app, make a web app have the kind of mobile capabilities and that native feel on a device. And this includes desktops. So to understand the progressive part of PWA, I like this strategy that came up with Aaron Gustafson from Microsoft, where he think of it like a peanut M&M, where the content that you're serving is the nut. The presentation layer, so like your CSS and the pretty, your images, stuff like that, is the chocolate, and then your client-side scripting, so your JavaScript and the part of the PWA lives in that hard candy shell. So it's that very small, thin layer, that tiny little piece that makes it a PWA. So how you're presenting your stuff to your client. So I see some people taking some photos, so anybody else want to take a photo real quick? My slides will be available as well. But yeah, that hard candy shell is where your progressive web app features will live. So if you're that visual learner person, you have that peanut M&M, and we'll refer back to this later as well. So with progressive web apps, so you have your unofficially official logo right here, but progressive web apps have many different pieces to it, but that's the technical definition. I'm not going to read it off, but we're going to highlight a few different things with it. So obviously it's got to be progressive. What we talked about in that peanut M&M earlier. Responsiveness, connectivity independent. So it doesn't matter if you're on a 4G, 5G, or Wi-Fi, or no connectivity. Your PWA should work across all of these. Should feel app-like, fresh. It's not stagnant content that you're always serving. It's great for static websites, but the content should be fresh. Re-engageable and discoverable. Installable and linkable. So these are things that we'll highlight in a little bit, but I just wanted to go through this list really quick. So now that we kind of understand what makes up a PWA, the core pieces to understand what certain browsers, when they're looking at if your website is a PWA, if your web app is a PWA, these are the things it's specifically looking for before it triggers anything within the browser. So responsiveness. If your web app is not responsive, it's not going to serve a great experience for your user, and it's not going to be very well rendered on a mobile web browser. So all of us are developers, and I'm sure most of us aren't the best designers out there, but this is something that we should definitely not overlook or work with a UX UI designer. So that mobile UI presentation on a small form factor is key with how we keep our users. And that's the part that helps them feel like they're in an app. So the next piece is having a web app manifest. And you couldn't even have a PWA without this file. And so it's a little JSON file that you deploy with your website. And so I have two links here. appmanifest.firebaseapp.com is a great tool that allows you to generate. So you just, instead of having to worry about like how the key value pairs line up and which order, and there's really no order, but how you formulate the manifest file, you just go to that, it's a form that you fill out and it generates it for you. So really, really cool and useful. Then you have the manifest validator. So what you could do is you could point it to a URL, or you can copy and paste your code in there if you manually wrote it, and it will manually validate your manifest file, so that way you're able to know if, because sometimes when you're writing with JSON manually, you might forget a quote or there's a comma missing or something like that. So it helps validate that for you before you even deploy it. But it'll also check deployed manifest files as well, if your website is correctly serving your manifest file. So you're able to do that with those two links. And then we have the web install banner. So this is what it looked like a few versions of Chrome ago. Now it's a smaller little window banner that pops up. So this image is a little dated, but it engages your user. So like if you went to the DevFest Florida website and you saw a little banner pop up across the bottom that said add to home screen, and so that's what the new install banner looks like. And that allows you to add it to your home screen, and then in the newer versions of Android, it'll also add it to your app drawer. So that way it feels and acts like a native app within all of your other apps. So you have that. I'll get it at the end. And then the other part to keep in mind is the browser will only recognize this file if it's served over HTTPS. So if your website isn't being served over HTTPS, the browser's not going to even recognize that this file even exists. So you have to make sure that you're using HTTPS. And then having a valid service worker attached to this. And we'll get to service workers in a little bit. But these are the pieces that you need to have in order to serve your web app manifest. And then, so here's an example of a web app manifest. It's very, very small, so I'm only serving a couple different icons. And so, you probably forgot to say, I forgot to say, hey, so you're talking about installing your web app as an app and stuff like that. Well, so here you can pass it along icons at different sizes that allow you to render on different screen sizes. And so with the app manifest Firebase app, you can submit a single graphic that you want to be your app icon. And then when it generates the output JSON that it gives you, it generates those different sizes and then lists them all here for you. So it makes it much easier for you to be able to do all that. So I'm only including a couple here just for brevity within the slide, but these are some of the features that you can do. And so obviously you want to link with your manifest in your HTML file at the head, and then your JSON manifest. So this is your web.manifest file that you include with your deployment, just to let the browser know what your short name is, what the name is, what the start URL is. And the start URL is a great way if you're wanting to track analytics from if people are using your PWA. So whenever people launch your PWA, you can tag in, it came from the home screen that people are using the PWA. So this is a way that you can prove back to the business cases that, hey, the PWA is getting used. I wouldn't put a specific directory or file here for your PWA. It's best to use the home for it. It's like when you're bookmarking, you want to go back to that specific page. But when you're designing a PWA, you want it to be app-like, so whenever people start it back up, they're coming to that fresh place, that fresh site. So if you were to put a specific URL in here, they're not always getting the fresh. They're not getting an app-like feel if you're sending them back to the same page every single time. So that's kind of why you don't have a particular file that they're landing on in that start URL. And then with display, you can have standalone, full screen, or minimal UI. And what that is essentially telling the browser is when they're launching your PWA, how should it present? If it should have the Chrome wrapper around it or the browser wrapper. If it should be full screen, which, your taskbar, the notification bar, the clock and everything, should that appear with the app? Or standalone, where it feels like an app but doesn't take up the whole screen. So it depends on the use case for your app on which type you should use. Standalone is most likely the best because that's typically what mobile apps go for as well, where you can still have the navigation at the bottom for Android, and then you still have your notification bar and the time still showing up at the top. So this way you still get an app-like feel without it needing to be full screen. If you were doing like maybe a web app game or something like that where you want the full screen aspect, that's where you would go more full screen on that. And then the other thing you could do, and this is again vanilla JavaScript, if you are using a particular framework, it kind of helps you with this, but you you can also control how the browser serves that add to home screen thing that pops up. So you can use the before install prompt to capture that, and then you could serve it later like this. So whenever you want to say, hey, show add to home screen, or hey, do you want to add this to your home screen? You can then prompt the user then at that point when you want to, because you're capturing what the browser already tried to serve. So that's a way that you can manually control. So instead of like how the DevFest Florida website, where it's just every time it's trying to throw it to you now, you can now control how you present that to your user, things like that. And then we have push notifications. So this is not something that's necessarily required for a PWA, but it's a way for your users to re-engage with your mobile app. And just like a native app, you still have to ask for their permission to be able to send them push notifications. So you have that kind of handshake with the user that, yes, I do want to receive push notifications from this web app. So you have that ability to do that. I'm going to take excuse me. Pardon me. This also requires a service worker. Again, I know I'm building up to the service worker, We'll get to that. But yeah, so with the push notifications, as I mentioned, they're able to re-engage with the user. It's available on Chrome, Firefox, Edge, and the Samsung S browser. Safari's almost there. There's stuff coming out for it, and I have some more to come with that. But the key part here to remember is it requires the user's permission. So it's very, very app-like. And then you will have the ability to also capture it and ask the user for their permission when you want to. You shouldn't do it like how some native apps do, where the second they open up the app, like, hey, do you want push notifications? So you should serve that whenever there's an action that the user does that say, hey, now would you like to do push notifications? Because we all hate it when we go to a website and like asking for our location or wants to send us push notifications the second we visit it. So you should serve those in a meaningful way, so that way it's not annoying the users and you're not losing the user right away. Ask them when it's meaningful. Now, service workers. Cool. So for those of you who don't know service workers, because when I've been saying that, some smiles are going, hey, get to it. So, so for those of you who don't know what service workers are, it's a script that runs in the background. It's shipped and deployed with your website that is separate from your web page, your website. It responds to different events, like network events, made from the page that it serves. The design behind it is an entirely short lifetime. So it's not meant to be running all the time. It's just an event listener that happens to the side of your web app. So it's listening for things like connectivity state, request for the Bluetooth, request for location, these kind of things. So you're able to do all of this in the push notifications. It's all done with the service worker. So it's listening for these type of events on the side. The key point to know here is a service worker cannot run without HTTPS enabled. It's the security handshake that happens with the browser that lets the browser know that this service worker came from this domain and is supposed to work with this web app. a lot of mobile devices, or all mobile devices, share that security handshake. So if let's say I open up your PWA on Chrome, and then I bounce over to Edge, that handshake still exists in the background on the mobile device layer. And so that way, it already knows that this service worker works with this PWA, and so Edge is able to handle all those still the same requests. So that handshake happens in the background, and that is secure on the device. So that way, there's no man in the middle, there's no way for somebody to kind of snipe your events, because it's that HTTPS handshake with the device between the browser. And so an example of a service worker for offline caching, this is a lot of pseudocode up here, but how it's working is whenever your website, whenever somebody visits your PWA, the service worker gets installed and cached on the device. And then on first request, typically it's going to go to a cloud or some external service to request that content and bring it back. And then after that point for offline caching, the service worker knows that, hey, the device is offline whenever the next request comes in, so it can tell the device to just use your local cache for whatever content whenever they come back to the PWA. Or on the front end, they're able to, as the developer, you're able to say, hey, my service worker just told me I'm offline, so I can serve them a little banner that says, please wait until you're reconnected, or something like that. Some error-free way to hand this off to your user. And again, the service worker would handle similar requests whenever you're asking for access to NFC, push notifications, camera, GPS. Pardon me, excuse me. So when to use offline. So this is a special case that not all of your apps have to do, but every PWA should do this in some form or fashion in order to maintain the app-like feel. So all of us are very familiar with the Chrome dinosaur, and we all love playing the game, but we should not have him anymore on our PWAs. So with the service worker, we're able to handle if the connection gets flaky, or if there's whenever the app goes offline. As I mentioned, as the developer, we're able to control what happens for our user when we lose that connectivity. So we're able to make them feel like they're still within an app, still serve them something, instead of just completely, hey, back to the Chrome dinosaur. For example, this isn't a PWA, but has anybody seen the HTML-only version of Gmail? So a couple hands. What's? Yeah, for slow connections. So that's not a PWA, but that's an example of still being able to serve and handle the request to your user without having to completely go, hey, sorry, doesn't work. So having something to be able to serve to your users, to be able to still let them engage and do whatever they came to your web app to do. And then we're going to, so now we're going to look at a little bit of architecture for how do we serve this to our users, so that way they know that they're still within an app. And this is the application shell, the app shell for short. And so those of you who've used a framework like Angular, React, Vue, frameworks like this, for single page apps, you kind of get this already whenever you're designing a single page app. Using this top level resource, you're able to put pixels on the screen immediately. And if you were in Chris's talk this morning, he talked about how to get those pixels to the screen very, very fast, and how you're able to serve that lightweight application shell right away. And of course, cats again. So, but it loads instantly, and this is something that is cached on the user's device, so that way, whenever they come back to your PWA, it's served instantly. You're not waiting for it to load, because it's this lightweight. It's part of that candy shell. Remember the peanut M&M? It's part of that candy shell that serves right away. So it's just, so you have the drawer, and then you have the main part of the content. So you have your title bar with the simple menu navigation, and a little content block where the content's supposed to show up. So the content, that nut, comes later, the peanut. So another example of the peanut M&M you have, so this is not Wikipedia, but this is another developer, Jake Archibald, who created an offline version of Wikipedia. And so you have your application shell off to the side, and then once the content loads, it's there. So you immediately come right to, an app-like interface without having to, wait, like with the spinner, as Chris was talking about in his talk this morning. So this way, you're presenting something to the user, and the user gets to see and potentially start using it right away while your content comes in, because content sometimes is slow. So we're going to touch on some examples, resources, and tools, so that way I can make all of you the best PWA developers ever. So you've probably seen this a couple times today, depending on what talks you were in, but Lighthouse is an amazing tool that was created by the Chrome team at Google, and now it's baked into Chrome developer tools. So it's that, as web developers, it's that command log that you can get into. It allows you to do auditing, performance metrics, best practices. There's also a CLI version, and there's also an extension that you can add to Chrome that allows you to run Lighthouse stuff. So I have a link down here towards for Lighthouse, and again, my slides will be shared out. But Lighthouse is a great tool to help you identify what parts of your PWA need improvement. If you're serving heavy images, if your script is too heavy, things like that. And then there's Workbox. So this is a newer tool that the Chrome team came out with at Google, where it allows you to, so instead of having to rewrite how to do a PWA every single time, Workbox allows you to do this. It generates this boilerplate for you to where it'll help you pre-cache your files, route requests, handling third-party requests, things like that. And it replaces, if you've already been developing PWAs, it replaces SW Precache and SW Toolbox. So it kind of combines those, adds a few more libraries in, and allows you to just jump right in. For those of you who've not started a PWA yet, I advise looking at the Workbox lab. If you've already developed a PWA, we have a lab that teaches you how to migrate from the SW Precache and Toolbox to Workbox. So we have these two links here on how you can learn how to migrate your web app, your PWA, if you've already done that. So again, slides are coming out. I see people keep going with the phones. And then some fun examples of PWA. So there's this resource called pwa.rocks, and it has tons and tons of examples of production PWAs, as well as kind of example like the air horner and the Wikipedia, the PWA that I shared a couple slides ago, where examples of PWAs and how you can implement different features that I've talked about in this talk. And there's another resource here, pwa-directory.appspot.com, that has a bunch of them, but then also shows the Lighthouse score for each of those PWAs. So you can see, if you're having trouble implementing a certain feature that one of these other PWAs have and trying to get that 100% Lighthouse score, you can look at this directory to see how it was developed, and many of them have their GitHub or whatever source that they're using tied to it, so that way you can see how they've implemented it. An example of, so recently Google Photos came out with a PWA version of their Google Photos app, because they know Google Photos app gets kind of heavy on no matter what device you're on and how much caching the app does and stuff like that. So there's a PWA version now. And again, cats. So, so if you want to try it out, just go to photos.google.com. You're going directly to the URL that you would normally go to on your desktop, and then it recognizes you're on a mobile device, so it's responsive. It has the web app manifest, it has a service worker, so it understands that you're doing this, and so there's tons of features available, and it's all done through your browser. It acts just like the Google Photos app. Then there's also Twitter Lite. Some of you might remember when Twitter did a big announcement that they were coming out with a PWA. The thing I don't advise, and I hate about this slide, even though I made this slide, is their URL that they're using for their PWA. You should not force the user to go to a different URL that they're than they're used to. So like when I go to twitter.com on my mobile device, it should just work like a PWA, or should be mobile responsive, should be mobile friendly. I shouldn't have to be redirected to another URL just to use the mobile version of what I'm going there for. So I do not recommend doing that for using a mobile dot or using /mobile or anything like that. But if you want to see how Twitter took their native app and turned it into a PWA and you have all of the same features, there's an example, and then light.twitter.com is how they did it. So they blogged about how they turned their native app into a PWA. And some fun resources. So at Google, we have a bunch of different resources. So these are all the dev docs on PWAs. You can find tutorials, code labs, all kinds of fun stuff on learning different parts of a lot of what I talked about in this talk, and then some more learning. And then this is another fun site that Jake Archibald put out, where is Service Worker ready? You notice Safari and Edge are green. So Safari has been working on their Service Worker implementation for the browser. So it is coming to Apple devices. Not everything is available just yet, but they are working on it. And so many of the features will be used, it can be used across all of these browsers. But if you go to this website to see if whatever you're implementing is available across these devices, so instead of having to test on all the devices, this website will tell you what version is running on devices and lets you know if that piece of the service worker is available yet. And the other part with the PWA, regardless of what device it's running on, it still should be served. So if there's no Bluetooth, if you don't have access to Bluetooth, your app should still work without Bluetooth, unless it's heavily dependent on just Bluetooth. But these are things like, with the service worker, you should still have that failover. It shouldn't just break your PWA. And then just kind of cycling back over everything, PWAs are still growing. There's many more evolutions to come. There's lots of more fun stuff coming. And hopefully you can take these methodologies and build your own fun PWAs. I know this is very, very high level and intro, but hopefully it kind of establish the groundwork for you to go out and build your own PWAs. So thank you very much. Again, this on Twitter, and thank you all for coming.